Unleashing your best in life and work. This is the Game Changers with Eric Bowles and host Dale Dixon.
Being vulnerable, present, and courageous to unleash your best in life and work. This is the Game Changers with Eric Bowles, an executive coach, leadership expert, change consultant, and keynote speaker. And Eric, great to be with you today.
Hey, glad to be here again. Glad to be here again, Dale.
I have got to give you this feedback. I have shared our most recent episode with a number of friends and said, hey, you've got to listen to this. There's some really good stuff, good content. And within about 30 minutes, I get this text message back. Okay, what are my values? And so there's this group of us that have been sharing our values with one another and saying, okay, this is my list. What does your list look like? And vice versa. And working on this with our families, where we work. So it's already having an impact.
I got to tell you, Dale, that not only is that what it's about, but that's the practical application, right? I was once told by an individual, he said, nothing changes until something actually moves. And so everything we talk about here, the goal is to be, maybe it's a small action, but the goal is that it has significant impact, right? And sometimes those little small practices have significant impact, and it also helps facilitate some pretty cool conversations.
And just so our listeners are not left out thinking, okay, what are they talking about? During the last episode, really the inaugural episode of this edition of the podcast, we talked about this idea of leading with purpose. And you have this fantastic concept of a ship above water and below water and how our lives are like that. And it's working on what's under the water, what people can't necessarily see, that we start working on. And out of that, we list our values, but there has to be alignment in our values. I'll let you're much more apt at giving the overview of what we're talking about here so people can catch up really quick, but we definitely recommend you go back and listen to that first episode.
Yeah, so when we talk about lead with purpose, we do want to emphasize there's life above the waterline and life below the waterline. When we talk about life below the waterline, those are the things you can actually measure. And we'll talk about that as the podcast continue on, but that's problem solving, prioritizing, all the things that people are very comfortable with measuring, the results, how we're doing. But life below the waterline, those are the things that you can't necessarily see, but they have huge influence on how we react and respond to the things that you can see. So for instance, when we talk about a ship, what allows a ship to get through all the storms, the waves, those things that are inevitable, it's like our lives as leaders, it's the keel of the ship that dictates how well we handle those storms. Not how big our sails are, not how big the hull are. Those things are they play a role. But the keel, which is beneath the surface, has so much to do with how we're able to not only manage or survive the tosses and turns and the rapids of change, but also how we thrive through it.
Fantastic. Okay, so this week, to carry on, we look at vulnerability, being present. I'm really excited to dive into that one.
Okay.
And being courageous as well. So lay this out for us. What's the game plan?
Okay, so here's the game plan. All of these things work together. So even when we talked about being authentic, and we started there last week talking about our values, keep in mind that all these things that we are talking about, being authentic, living in alignment with our values. What does that do for a leader? It makes you more trustworthy, worthy of another person's trust. It's hard to have influence, hard to be a leader if your people can't trust you. So when we're talking about living in alignment with our values and seeing how that was the reason for that. These next three that we're talking about are also significant. Now, all these things kind of merge together. So I hope people don't kind of go through it thinking all these are compartmentalized. No, they don't. But it's just a nice way of referencing them. So we're going to talk about being vulnerable today and why is such a critical component being an influential leader. I'm going to define vulnerability. The word vulnerability literally means assailable, being assailable, open to danger, right? And so people want to know, why would I be open to that, right? Because, but you hear vulnerability talked about so much. It's good for a leader to be vulnerable. But I'm telling you, there's a lot more books written about vulnerability than people actually practicing vulnerability. And so we're going to talk about how there's practical benefits from doing that. So we're not using vulnerability to sit around singing Kumbaya. That's not the purpose of it. But the purpose of it is that it collapses time. When we talk about being present, I will tell you that is a big one. And I'm glad you're interested or excited to really dig into that one, Dale, because I believe that is one of these all work together. But I think the ability to be in the moment, the ability to think clearly in the moment is a game changer, like for a lot of individuals. And we dig into that. And the reason we finish with courage is because courage is kind of that virtue by all the other ones depend. So, right? I mean, it's tough to live in alignment with my values without some courage. It's tough to be vulnerable without some courage. It's tough to be present without some courage. And so this is how they all kind of function together.
Okay. Let's dive in. The vulnerability aspect. So when I say vulnerability, especially as I think about being open to danger, there's a part of me that thinks, oh, adrenaline rush. I kind of like that. But let's dive in and what does this vulnerability look like in the business setting? And I'll go here in that I hear a lot of people get a bit concerned about vulnerability because they don't think about guardrails first. That's right. And they think, I'm going to, what if I overshare?
Yeah. So one of the things to keep in mind, the purpose of being more authentic, more vulnerable, more present, more courageous, was to support what we came up with at the very beginning, which is your vision. Remember, we're not having a strong keel just to have a strong keel. The reason we got the strong keel to our ship is to get to a place, right? And so when we talk about these ways of being, it's for the purpose of, reaching your vision, reaching your goal. We believe when we do more of these things, it collapses time. We're not just being more vulnerable because it's something to do. Like, we're being more vulnerable because it actually collapses time, allows us to get to our destination faster. Now, one way of, let me emphasize this. Here's what allows people probably to embrace the conversation around vulnerability even more effectively. In a very practical way, vulnerability manifests itself in the ability to give and receive feedback. Now, we can talk about vulnerability in all kinds of ways, but it's the ability to give and receive feedback. Now, in a very practical way, Dale, I tell leaders this quite often, that your actions and your decisions as a leader will only be as wise as the information it's based on. So for me to make a wise decision, it's probably a good idea that I have good information. But it is fascinating how many leaders give feedback, but they don't take feedback. So they're making a lot of decisions with incomplete information. I ask groups of leaders all the time, what does it feel like to be wrong? That's my question. What does it feel like to be wrong? Okay. And you hear all kinds of answers. Now, I got to tell you a funny one. Those who've heard me speak, heard me say this before. I was with one particular client, and I asked a question and it went dead silent, Dale, for like 2 minutes. Now, in a public setting, like 2 minutes is a long time. That's a lot of quiet. And I'm comfortable with uncomfortable silences, but this one went a long time. Finally, a guy raised his hand in the back and says, surprising? That was his answer to being wrong. So anyways, I had a little fun with that. But typically, no one feels good about being wrong. And I hear all answers that, it sucks. It doesn't feel good. I feel like I'm letting people down, especially as leaders in business. We don't like to be wrong. But my next statement to that is this. Those answers are maybe accurate, but not fully complete. Because what they told me was what it felt like when they discovered they were wrong. Hear me now. The question is, how long did you go being wrong before you found out? That's the expensive part. Being wrong wasn't the expensive part. The expensive part was how long did you go being wrong? How many people were around you who could have helped course correct before you even got to that spot? I mean, sometimes we don't measure, or more importantly, we don't monetize the cost of functioning for a while with bad information. I mean, I used to get the question all the time, like, Eric, what qualifies you to spend time telling all of us business leaders, since my background was football at the time, even though I've been in business way longer than I played football. But I would get this from leaders at times. They're like, okay, Eric, what kind of qualifies you for being an executive coach and all these things? I was like, well, In the NFL, and I believe this, in the NFL, I believe the worst run franchises are still ran better than 99% of organizations in the world. And people look at me sideways going, what makes you, what? I was like, it is not the selection process. All you got to do is watch the news. So it's not a personnel thing. It doesn't mean we got far more intelligent, none of those things. It's for one reason and one reason only. Video cameras. We have completely objective feedback continuously. We don't have 360 performance reviews that are anonymous. Okay, we don't get semi-annual performance. We don't find out that like 3 months into the job that I've been doing a bad job, but I have a leader who didn't want to tell me, so they waited till we finally had our sit down. No, in our world, we don't have 3 months to wait. So we literally need feedback frequently in order to course correct. In most organizations, that's what they're missing. And so this very concept of vulnerability, the more vulnerable a leader is, the faster they can give and receive feedback, the quicker they can collapse time with good decision making. And it's just got to be vulnerable enough to ask for it. It's amazing how many leaders are making decisions and giving direction, yet not receiving any feedback coming in towards them to be able to make sure those decisions are wise.
So I immediately think about leaders being being mushrooms, i.e. kept in a dark room, fed BS. And for that, and leaders, I often say they're the last to know because everybody's trying to protect their position in the organization and not bring bad news to a leader or not provide feedback that might be seen as negative. So where does the leader start in identifying that they're in that place, they're in the dark room, or that they have people just lined up to stroke their ego, so to speak?
Well put. I remember the late Colin Powell had a great line. He says, bad news is not like wine. It doesn't get better with age, right? And so he was always talking about how important it is to get it right away. This is why when we talk about life below the waterline, this matters so much. It has to do with relationship. So what gives you access to the information is people's trust level. So the word trust, or more importantly, I like to say it this way, trust grows through the exchange of information. The more vulnerable the information, the greater the level of trust. So when I have a leader who comes to me and actually asks my thoughts, ask for feedback. Here's a simple tool that I've had leaders do. Look, sit down with your team who's closer to the situation than you can ever realize. I've always tell, even in professional sports, we just say, in the locker room, everybody knows the truth. So many times I tell a coach, I said, look, you just got to have people on your team who tell you the truth, but you got to be willing to hear the truth. You can't create an environment where they're afraid to share the truth. We like to live kind of in a world where, hey, if I'm not getting any feedback, everything must be okay. Man, I've been married 26 years. That is a bad strategy, right? Like, my wife isn't saying anything. I shouldn't be sitting there going, man, everything must be okay, right? But from a leadership standpoint, it's literally going to your folks. And it doesn't have to be bad news. It's just, where can we improve? So one of the techniques or tools I've encouraged people to use is simply just go to your people and say, a scale of 1 to 10. How would you say we're doing right now at this? Scale of 1 to 10. How are we doing at this? Go to your customers. Hey, scale of 1 to 10. How are we doing at this? I am aware of all the formal feedback tools that exist, but we're moving too fast. And so I'm always encouraging people, you got to have some informal, frequent feedback tools that let you adjust on the fly. So when you go to your people, hey, scale of 1 to 10, how are we doing, in this? Scale of 1 to 10 as a leader, how am I doing with giving you the correct information? The reason I add that number scale of 1 to 10, because everybody who has a team, they have some people who are going to say, oh man, everything's a 9, it's perfect. Or, no, everything's a 10, it's great, wherever the case may be. And then you got the ones who are Debbie Downers who are like, man, it's a 3, it's terrible, whatever. The number is irrelevant. Leaders, when you hear me what I'm saying. You're going to work hard anyway. So you might as well work hard with good information. So the next question you ask is what you're after. If they said a 9, great, but what would make it a 10? What would make it a 10? Now you got something to, well, maybe if we did this or considered this, now I got information to work with. if somebody is just a Debbie Downer and they said, hey, I give it a 2, I give it a 3, I'm not going to ask, why is it a 2 or a 3? I don't have time to spend on that all day. My question is, what would make it a 10? Because whatever the reason is a 2 or 3, even if we solve what makes it a 2 or 3, it doesn't make it a 10. Okay? And now it just moves it to neutral. No, but if I ask that question, it's like, well, this is what would make it a 10. Okay, now I have workable information by which we can work on. So I'm asking, I tell leaders all the time, ask for feedback regarding how you're leading, ask for feedback on how they think you're doing, if it's a constant loop of this, the more you do that, the more it's almost like priming the pump. The flow of information starts going back and forth. I always like to say, I always believe football is almost like a precursor of what's happening in the business world. I know that sounds great, but I really believe that. Like, there was a time when a head coach or offensive coordinator, they spent all their time just telling the players what to do. If people pay attention now, the amount of coaches who are spending more time asking the quarterback first, asking the lineman first, constantly, tell me what's going on out there. Tell me what you see. What's the subtle thing? So now we have eyes from up top, we have eyes from the sideline, and we have eyes on the field where the information is flowing back and forth. And because people are willing to give feedback, we can all course correct faster. That's the primary purpose for a leader being more vulnerable.
That is so rich in and of itself. I think if we can walk away from this podcast by just going out and asking that question, identify something specific in the business tomorrow, today, on a scale of 1 to 10, how are we performing in this specific area? And I would encourage, and hopefully you agree, you got to get specific in asking the question.
Yes.
The quality of the question determines the quality of the answer.
Dale, that's it all the time. I say all the time, generalities always lead to more questions. Specificity leads to answers. So when I can ask that question specifically around one particular area, it allows them to wrap their minds around it. Now we're moving. And the other thing that it does, which is a secondary benefit, Dale, is allows those on your team to live in the solution instead of the problem. Now they have a vested interest in it. And here's the greatest benefit. People are typically up on what they're in on. So the very fact that you ask them, what do you think could be made better? And don't stop there. They give you, what are some ideas you think we can implement that? What do you think about that? All of a sudden, people have a vested interest in seeing something improve. And it all changes from you asking for that feedback. Also, what's great is once that becomes the norm, they start receiving feedback better because they know it's not one way. It's a form of communication. I'm telling you, I tell leaders, like, if there's some leaders, if they didn't do anything else but what I'm describing right now, that would be one of the biggest game changers. They're working hard already. They're just, in sports we call it, but it's just wasted motion. You're busy, but you're just busy using all that athleticism and talent on things that aren't the problem. Your people know what the real problem is. So many people work on the problem that isn't versus the problem that is, and they can get to what is with information, with just, asking for it. Great place to start practicing this is at home. I said, be selective when you ask, though. I sometimes go to my wife and say, hey, honey, scale of 1 to 10. How am I doing at serving you right now? I try to time it perfectly, though, right? When I already know I've done something well.
All right. So the segue to the next one, it would be, thanks for that information, Eric. We'll talk later, So let's talk about being present.
Yeah. Okay, so the first thing I want everybody to know, when we talk about being present, we're literally talking about the ability to be in the moment, Now, everybody must understand focus is not natural. It's a discipline. You have to practice it. It's something that you don't try to do. It's something that you train to do, right? Being in the moment. Now, the reason why this probably is the area, this concept that probably influences me the most is because I say it this way. Being present is the ability to bring all of your attention to bear on something or someone, right? It's that ability to bring all of my capacity, my ability to listen to everything right into a moment or a situation. Okay. Now, what are the benefits of it? One is even just sheer communication, what people don't always grasp is that almost 90% of, and you know this, Dale, almost more than 90% of communication is nonverbal. So it's body language, it's tone, it's inflection. And so often, that's why, you know, people get thrown off by an email or a text and they read into stuff that isn't there. But when we're present, my words have an impact, but my tone, inflection, body language, if I'm paying attention to it all, 90% of the message, if I'm not present, I'm missing. And I tell this to leaders all the time. I said, that's why you want to see the eyes of your people. This is why I say, listen with your eyes, not just with your ears. This is why you're paying attention. We say this in sport, but in business it's huge. Because if 90% of the message is not just in the words, then what are you missing when you're not paying attention? Like this, I mean, just imagine that. So with that being said, the art of aggressively listening, intentionally being there, listening with my eyes, quieting my mouth, observing. So many people look, but so few people observe. And so it's one of those things as a leader, and now it's a discipline, because there's times, and especially for leaders and those leaders I'm speaking to right now, and I say this it's meant to honor you, but at the same time, you got to be aware of how dangerous it can be. There are many leaders, because of who you are and what you've been able to do, and you may have started your business. So there are times where you can go from A to Z just like that. So you can see the problem or the challenge and instantly know where most likely it's leading. And that's phenomenal. The problem is sometimes you go so fast, you don't take people with you. And so because you skip ahead to what the solution is, you miss all the opportunity for the folks there to come along with the journey with you. So instead of them learning and figuring it out and going on the journey with you, what they're going to start doing is just giving you the problem, or sit back and wait until you solve it because you're going to solve it anyways. And what that happens in that moment is you become an incredible bottleneck. Instead of leveraging your intelligence, instead of intelligence getting multiplied, your DNA flowing into the organization, you become a bottleneck where everything stops with you or doesn't get started until it gets to you. And in the world we're living in right now, we can't function like that. So when we talk about being present, this is one of the tools, and we get into it, but this is one of the things we're moving towards.
So just to dive into that idea and make sure that I understand, and I'm going to tie it to vulnerability. So if I become a bottleneck in the business because every problem has to run through me, it's removing ownership from the people around me who can help solve the problems faster. They're probably not coming to me with feedback because of that, because, well, he'll solve the problem. And then the assumption starts happening, and I'm in the dark even more. So this becomes now a vicious cycle.
A vicious cycle, Dale. The one of the things, and I have to deal with leaders who tell me all the time how they don't have enough time, that they lack time. I said, there's a reason you lack time. So if you lack time, that means what you are really lacking is time to think. So not only are you a bottleneck in terms of problem being solved, the amount of time you get to spend thinking through the solution is limited because you're dealing with so many things you shouldn't. I say this to leaders all the time, that what happens is you end up actually carrying the responsibility. Like people have titles and positions, but their responsibility and authority don't match it. And so all of a sudden, everybody is performing at a level beneath their job description versus at it or above it. And that's expensive. So you mentioned being vulnerable, these all work together. So when I'm being truly vulnerable, it's important that I'm there. So I'm present. I'm there. Let me use it this way, and hopefully this will resonate with some folks. We use the phrase paying attention quite a bit, right? People say, hey, you need to pay attention. And they don't realize too often that that is a financial term. The word attention is currency. Your attention is currency. Why? Because it makes up the greatest currency that you have, which is your life. So anytime I give somebody my undivided attention, I am investing my life. Time I do not get back into whatever's getting my attention at the time. This is why I say all the time in a practical way, it's why grandkids love being with grandparents. Why? Because when the grandkids are with the grandparents truly understand that nothing else matters but those grandkids. This is why the grandkids feel it. They're esteemed every time. They're appreciated, which is another financial term. They're appreciated. Their value appreciates. Why? Because attention's being invested into them. This is why I tell leaders all the time, when you pay attention, make sure whatever you're paying attention to is worth the return. Like, make sure it's worth the investment. We pour our attention into so many things that aren't giving us any return on it. And so part of your practice is recognizing how valuable your attention is. So then when you are being present, first of all, you know its significance. Part number two is when you're investing your attention into the people that you work with and lead and you really listen to them, they are naturally appreciated. Their value goes up because my leader values me enough to listen to me. What's the opposite of appreciation is depreciation. How do we depreciate others? By removing our attention. You come to talk to me, my eyes are going both directions behind your back, and I'm looking at my phone. I cut it off. I sell you out. It is better for a leader to say, right now is not a good time. I want to give you my undivided attention. Let's meet at this time. Or somebody says, hey, do you have a minute? I say, I only have 2, but if you need more than that, let me know. It's respectful, plus it allows them to understand, I want to give you my undivided attention. The value that happens when somebody can look you in the eye, a leader work with you, and while you're talking about it, it's priceless. It's priceless.
So an anecdotal story that I hope our listeners can run experiments on to see if it actually works. But I was having a conversation with my barber about this very thing. And when we were talking about getting better, and he said, I am working on being more present. And I said, really? And I said, tell me about the experiences you've had. And he talked about grandkids. And I said, so what have you noticed is the biggest payoff from focusing on being present? He said, the biggest payoff is that time slows down.
Yes. Yes.
And I thought, wow, in this day and age when we're so busy and we're all complaining that I don't have enough time, if you want more time, be more present.
Dale, that's it. Literally, our entire lives are found in the present moment. Literally, when I'm not present, I'm not living. I actually had one of the executives that I coach. She's one of the most conservative. I'm talking about in terms of her how she carries herself, how she, not very flamboyant, anything. We have this talk. We go through this whole process around being present, the significance of it, the importance of it, the practice of it. So she began to practice it more at home than she did even in the workplace. So she practiced being present with her kids, practiced being present with her husband, instead of trying to look ahead or behind. She went and got a tattoo. I couldn't believe, still to this day, she's dear friend. We still talk about it. I said, and it's a symbol for being present. I said, that's pretty bold for you. She goes, it gave me my life back. She goes, Eric, nothing changed around me. The only thing that changed was me. And all of a sudden I realized I had a whole life. There's so much in a moment. My wife used to tell me all the time, honey, life is not made up of days, it's made up of moments. So your ability to be in the moment is what it's all about. So I tell people all the time, look, I am not asking you to figure out, okay, I got so much to do. How can I be more present? Here's what I ask leaders to do all the time. Just take some of the attention you're paying into stuff that isn't rewarding you. Don't sit around and act like you don't have tons of waste. There's certain things that are receiving your attention that aren't worthy of your attention. So I ask you to take away from that and give it to somewhere where it's going to be a great return. And when that happens, what a game changer.
Cool. Okay. Take us home.
Okay.
Now we've got to have the courage to be vulnerable and to be present.
Yes. So the courage it takes to be vulnerable, to ask for feedback. The word vulnerability means assailable, but it's talking about risk. There's a risk in being vulnerable. So we have to be courageous enough to take that risk. Why? Because there's no guarantee that in our vulnerability, it always works out. Does it raise the probability that we'll be more successful? Yes, but it's not a guarantee, right? There's a chance you being vulnerable might not always work out. that's that's why we do it. That's why our courage has to be there. It takes courage to sit back and ask my wife, honey, how would you say I'm treating you with significance? How would you say I'm serving you? Because once I hear the feedback, there's also an expectation I got to do something with it. And when people aren't always honest enough, sometimes we avoid feedback because we just don't want to have to commit to change when we know, I'd rather just live in this false belief that I'm doing everything right. It takes courage to be present. Why? Because there's a time when I have to listen and not talk. Man, it takes courage to actually give people space to finish their thought, to be present in the moment. I would say it takes courage to overcome, which is something I'm working on right now, especially in this year that we're going into, is I think the kids call it FOMO. It's like an acronym. It stands for fear of missing out, right? And I struggle with that, where I have this fear of missing out, but because I fear missing out, I lose the moment I'm already in. Like everything I want is right here, but I'm already thinking about what's next, or I'm thinking about what was behind. So it takes courage to slow myself down, to be quiet, just be present where I'm at. It takes a lot of courage. And one of the things I love, General Omar Bradley said it best. He goes, courage is simply being afraid, but it's doing it anyways. Like I'm afraid, but the reason for it is worth it. So when people tell me, well, Eric, does it take courage to be present? Yes. Now, you don't choose to be present with everybody, right? Like some people you just make, but at least you were intentional with it, right? But I would say this, that there's courage, and I love the term courage, but one of the best ways to overcome fear, and biblically it says, love conquers fear. Sometimes I got to tap into what I love more. Now, what do I love more than what I'm afraid of, right? And so when I have to practice being present in my home, when I got to be present in the business environment, man, deep down inside, man, I want what's best for my customers. I want what's best for those who work with me. I want what's best. So my fear of failure, my fear of not being enough, those fears didn't necessarily go away, but my love and my desire for them to be at their best has to trump that. And that's what really drives this. It's not like, oh, I just got to be. This isn't a macho courage. It's the kind of courage that's dripping in love, which means it's sacrificial. I mean, it's selflessness, right? That's the greatest form of courage that exists. So when we talk about all these things about life below the waterline, that's what we're really talking about.
Identifying that thing that you really love to feed the fires of courage.
That's it, Dale. I love how you described that. That's it.
Well, Eric, we have, this has been a fantastic conversation. You've given us 3 big things to work on for the coming week. So thank you very much as we think about vulnerability, the idea of presence and what it can do for us and the courage to live in it every day. I will ask that our listeners, if you would share this podcast with somebody who would benefit by hearing this message, these messages. If you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and write a review while you're out there. When you interact with us through your favorite podcast listening app, it helps bring it up higher in the search results when people are looking for leadership material. You can find Eric on LinkedIn. Just search his name and follow him there. Also, the website, thegamechangersinc.com. Did I get that right? Thegamechangersinc.com is where you can find Eric, and the website. Eric Bolles coaches, trains, and inspires leaders to unleash their potential and the potential of those around them. This is the Game Changers Podcast. We'll talk to you next week.
The Game Changers, unleashing your best in life and work with Eric Bolles and Dale Dixon. Eric is an executive coach, leadership expert, change consultant, and keynote speaker. Read his book, Moving to Great, and find him at ericbolles.com. Connect with Dale at daledixonmedia.com.